Presidency has announced the passing of AmaZulu traditional Prime Minister Mangosuthu Buthelezi. The 95-year-old was recently discharged from hospital where he had spent weeks. Let's now speak to Professor Musa Xulu, who is a heritage, cultural history and traditional knowledge expert from Indonsa, YeSizwe think tank. A very good morning to you. Thank you so much for your time. Of course, waking up to the very sad news, learning of the passing of Prince Mangosuthu Buthelezi. Of course, perhaps let's start right at the beginning and sort of get your reaction on the passing. We'd heard that he was recovering well, and at the time, of course, hearing that he should be given some space as he recovers, and now waking up to this sad news. What is your reaction?
Well, thank you very much, my sister, and good morning to all fellow South Africans. Let me first start by passing condolences on behalf of myself, on behalf of Indonsa, YeSizwe, to the Buthelezi family, a family we know very well as to the entirety of the Zulu nation, as well as all South Africans. He was known all over the world because he has been in public eyes since 1954. More or less, and working on this, he was very close to Inkosi Albert Iltuli and many other former ANC leaders, including Nelson Mandela. So it is significant that this announcement comes from the presidency or the president himself, because that is the stature of the man.
Yeah.
It could be problematic. It's a disaster because a lot of Zuluness, was around him. He worked very hard through the YeSizwe government and even in the post-1994 era to look after traditional institutions and to ensure that the cultural heritage, not only of the Zulu people, but of many other traditional communities, is maintained in the new South Africa. He was a man of great stature. The country will miss him.
For more than 7 decades, Prince Mangosuthu Buthelezi played a significant, active role in the political space. I mean, you also make mention there of his role in heritage and culture of AmaZulu. We know that before he even founded the IFP in 1975, he was a chief minister of KwaZulu-Natal, Bantustan. Perhaps let's go back to the history of a man who took significant steps to build a career in the world of politics and make a huge impact to the nation.
Oh, yes. No. He was in the ANC Youth League, and for his political activities in the 1940s, he was expelled from Fort Hare University. Had to finish his degree at Natal University by correspondence because he was considered to be a threat to the status quo. And then, of course, as I said, he was very close to very senior ANC leaders. And then in the 1971, he became chief minister of the KwaZulu homeland. Now, the homeland system, we all know, was designed by apartheid to divide South Africans. But for him, his approach was that he's going to use the homeland system as a base to further the aims and objectives of our liberation struggle. And when he started the IFP in 1975, we know it was upon instructions from the ANC in exile and also other leaders in the SADC region that he needed to have a membership-based organization fighting inside the country. Of course, after 1977, 1978, and 1979, the relationships between him and the ANC soured quite badly, which resulted in lots of black-on-black violence. But, of course, we all know you can't blame anybody for that because it was coming from many other angles. It can't just have been him doing that. Of course, then, as a result of his other efforts, when Nelson Mandela came out, or when Nelson Mandela was released from prison and the banned organizations were unbanned, late President F.W. de Klerk mentioned Buthelezi by name, that he had been very persistent on the release of Nelson Mandela as well as on the unbanning of political struggle liberation organizations. So that's it. And then after 1994, of course, it became Minister of Home Affairs for 10 years, serving under firstly President Mandela and secondly President Thabo Mbeki. And of course, he's been a member of parliament till his death.
As many others call him, Umntwana wakaPhindangene has been described as being without question one of the most polarizing, prolific political figures South Africa has ever produced. When you look at the work that he has done and the standing of the IFP as you and I speak, and how it was slowly regaining lost ground in his home province of KwaZulu-Natal, what sort of legacy do you think he leaves behind for the Inkatha Freedom Party as a party, as well as the role that he's played in politics?
Well, it could spell many things, because he was a central figure, even though he was no longer the actual president of the IFP. I know that for most decisions, they consulted with him for guidance, and that he attended almost every meeting of the National Executive Committee and National Committee of the IFP. And he was the voice that they all listened to, a unifying voice, really. Because, you know, political organizations in the New South Africa tend to have factions and so on. But he was the central figure in the IFP. So irrespective of what faction was talking, people would go to him for guidance and for inspiration. Now, I don't know what's going to happen. There are many scenarios that are likely to happen in the IFP. They may get votes of sympathy, for example, maybe for next year's elections, or if they don't unite, they may actually even split. It's either way, it's possible, because without that uniting figure, it's going to be very difficult to find a central message for them. But we will wait and see.
Yeah. And, I mean, you speak about a unifying voice who played a central role within the IFP. And, of course, he was no longer active as the face, but, of course, attending those meetings and still being very much a part of what happens behind the scenes of the IFP. Do you think, you know, as the party progresses and tries to gain lost ground in KwaZulu-Natal, that the heritage and the leadership that he has groomed around the party will perhaps carry the party forward as they try and commemorate him and learn from the visionary, unifying leadership that he endured?
It's too difficult to tell at the moment. What I know, for example, is that there has been an issue around, an unnecessary issue around who becomes Premier of KwaZulu-Natal if the IFP wins the provincial elections. So 4 or 5 names came forward and so on. And you know that it was never discussed at central committee level, but it was national committee level, but it was discussed in the corridors and in a polarizing manner between the 4 so-called candidates. They will have to work very hard to find each other, or find somebody who can unite them back into one vision, as Buthelezi did for 4 decades with the IFP since 1975. In next year, the other year, they're becoming 50 years old. It's going to be, he has been able to sustain them over that period because he understood politics, South African politics, from the 1940s, 1950s, better than anyone else in the IFP. Now, it's going to be difficult, I must say, up front, but maybe they will be able to come together and try to find a way.
I wanted us to expand a little bit on the unifying voice that you made mention of. As you described Mangosuthu Buthelezi, he was the traditional prime minister to the Zulu nation, but this was not at all a new role. It started as far back as the 1950s.
Yes, no, true. He was traditional prime minister to the late King Zulu, who passed on in 1968. He started that role around about 1953, 1952. So, and then he guided, of course, that king at a period when South Africa was a very difficult country to live in as a result of apartheid. Then in 1971, he was also very instrumental in ensuring the smooth transition from the late King Zulu to the new king who was coronated in 1971, the late King Zulu. And then, of course, they worked together very well. At that time, as I said earlier, Prince Mangosuthu Buthelezi was chief minister of the KwaZulu homeland. So they had some resources can go back and strengthen the Zulu kingdom. They were able to do that. Even Inkatha IFP, when they started in 1975, they started as a cultural liberation movement, as a Zulu cultural liberation movement, and later, only in 1990, did they change the name to the IFP. So, and of course, he was very instrumental in ensuring that, especially when it comes to the heritage of AmaZulu, Amahubo songs, commemorations of battles such as the Sandlwane and other historical events that happened and shaped the Zulu kingdom in the past happened because, as I say, they then had some resources as a result of the KwaZulu homeland government. And then, of course, when the late King Zwelithini passed on, we all know now, because we're now living in the period of TV and everything, he was extremely instrumental in ensuring the smooth rise to power, to the throne of the now King Zwelithini, King Misuzulu Zwelithini. And of course, we know that last year in October, President Ramaphosa was able to give the king the certificate that is ensuring that he's a king. Prince Mangosuthu played a lot of role in that because, as we know, behind the scenes, he had a lot of good relations with President Ramaphosa. They spoke a lot about many things, and that transition was very smooth and it was very spectacular. We all know Moses Mabhida Stadium was filled and so on and so on. And so, but now, unfortunately, and I must say this, because we raised this when the problems of relationships started between His Majesty the King now and Prince Mangosuthu Buthelezi. Our hope, and we expressed it everywhere, was that the two should come together and settle their differences.
Yeah, because from what we understood, that the feud between King Misuzulu and Prince Mangosuthu Buthelezi was at a point of no return. And of course, just listening to some of the statements and the conflicting statements over the health and whereabouts of the king, do you think that's where it started, or was it a problem much larger, perhaps?
Well, there were many players behind the scenes in making sure that the relationships between Prince Mangosuthu and His Majesty the King sour, and the rift grows every day. Unfortunately, as Africans, the whole issue of reconciliation is very important. So it's sad that he passes on before the reconciliation happens, because they've never met, maybe ever since the beginning of the year. And the rift, of course, continued to grow. And I remember even myself writing to His Majesty the King to say, please, you have the power and authority, just go visit Prince Mangosuthu Buthelezi. He's a very kind man, as you know. Just say, okay, now we're not going to discuss our problems in public. Of course, it didn't happen. So now maybe that is the darker side of it. And today, there is this red dance ceremony So it's going to sour even there when the ceremony, which Prince Mangosuthu Buthelezi supported so much since 1984, is not there for the first time ever in the history of the Zulu nation.
Yeah,
of the Red Dance ceremony.
Something very significant.
It's going to be very sour.
Yeah, yeah.
It's going to be very sour.
Do you think it may be cancelled as a result, or perhaps be used as a platform to, commemorate Prince Mangosuthu Buthelezi and his love for the Zulu nation as well as the country?
They could, but you remember, it's a ceremony, it's a festival. There would be mentions, but I can tell you even now as people drive towards Nongoma and they open their radio stations and look at social media statuses on their cell phones, it's going to be very sour, very, very sour today. And it's not possible to cancel because so much money has been spent on it, on transportation, on catering and on accommodation and all those other things, because the maidens come from all over. But I'm anticipating a mood that is not going to be very encouraging.
It's a massive cultural event which is set to also inject a lot of tourists and boost the economy. How significant is it as we look at the heritage and the culture of the Zulu nation?
Well, as I said earlier on, maybe last year, the Red Dance ceremony was introduced into the Zulu Kingdom in 1984 via the late Queen Mantfombi, who came from Eswatini, because they had this ceremony in Eswatini. So it was Zuluized in the passage of time. But before 1984, the Zulus and the maidens, their commemoration of relationship with deities and so on was different in that it was related to food security. So in the beginning of September, the Zulu maidens would go and plow what was called the garden of Nomkubulane, the female deity. But after that, of course, there was a lot of innovation in that. It started with maybe 200 or 300 maidens in 1984, but today we were told that to expect around 60,000 of them. It's not a ritual event. It's more of festivities celebrating womanness and virginity of the young maidens. But it's not like something that you go and speak to the ancestors. It's not ritualized. It's more of a festival. But the spectacular aspects of it, that tourists like to look at things that are spectacular. The thousands of maidens just, last year I saw them starting at around about 9, and by 5 p.m. they had not finished, just to go there and submit the raid to His Majesty the King. So it's very spectacular. I don't know the future of things because for the first time, as I said, Prince Mangosuthu Buthelezi is not there. And unfortunately, the announcement is that he has passed on. He touches the hearts of many traditional leaders here, especially Amakhosi, and he touches the hearts of many households, especially the older generation of people, because he is seen as a unifying voice even for the Zulu Kingdom, and somebody who for seven decades stood up to say, no, Zuluness built by King Shaka cannot die as a result of apartheid or as a result of democracy. So he is going to be a little bit on the somber side of things.
Yeah, absolutely. Professor Musa Xulu, let me thank you very much for paying a tribute there and giving us a breakdown of the life and times of Prince Mangosuthu Buthelezi. Professor Musa Xulu is a heritage, cultural history and traditional knowledge expert from Indonsa YeSizwe think tank, just sharing that life there. And as I read back, of course, looking at the a statement released by President Cyril Ramaphosa describing Prince Mangosuthu Buthelezi as an outstanding leader in the political and cultural life of our nation. We will continue throughout the course of the morning, of the day, of the next few weeks, of course, to bring you some reaction on the now late Prince Mangosuthu Buthelezi.